So there have been some studies that have been done about how much of the violence that's taking place in Afghanistan right now is directly caused by our presence there. That is, there is some component of the violence in Afghanistan that is because of conflict inside Afghanistan, and some component of the violence in Afghanistan that is a resistance to the presence of foreign troops. You, I think, Matt, are familiar with some of that research. Can you give us an estimate of what percentage, roughly, of the violence in Afghanistan they think is being directly caused by our presence there?
Well, in terms of the overall violence, I'm not quite sure. I know Robert Pape of University of Chicago has done research specifically relating to suicide bombings and how suicide bombings tend to correlate with foreign occupations. And he estimates, he looks at some 80% of the suicide bombings. He estimates around 80 to 90% of the suicide bombings are just a result of a foreign occupation. 80% of those bombings are directed at U.S. and foreign troops. And this is a really important statistic, that 90% of those suicide attacks are carried out by Afghans. They're not carried out by foreign fighters, as we saw in Iraq.
So if we look at the gross domestic product in Afghanistan, we've talked a little bit about the fact that we're spending roughly $100 billion a year on our military presence in Afghanistan. How does that compare to the gross domestic product for Afghanistan as a whole?
Roughly about $14 billion a year, illicit. When I talked about Afghanistan earlier, there's no industrial base there. The only item, the only industry that has an actual value chain from being able to get credit to purchase fertilizer and to pay for labor and a ready and available market is the opium trade, or the poppies. That's the only industry that has a value chain. Everything else, the components aren't there and won't be there for decades. And you're certainly not going to get development without having a degree of stability. So there's not a lot going for Afghanistan, to say in a very simple, crass way.
Okay, and so a GDP of about $14 billion, and we're spending $100 billion a year on the military presence there, while we're laying off American teachers because we can't afford to pay them, correct? All right, so that begs a question, which is, and maybe you'd like to take this one briefly, why are we still there?
There are two questions that a lot of people are asking. Can this war be won, and what does that mean? And what it means is morphing over time. As we see the level of difficulty, the what it means answer is becoming far broader, and we are willing to approach Afghanistan in the same fashion as we changed our view of what victory in Iraq meant, that we may be dealing with actors today that we may not have wanted to deal with a couple of years ago. And the second question that Darcy's getting after is is it worth it, or the so what question. And there's a retired Marine colonel out there who teaches at the National Defense University. His name is T.X. Hammes. He wrote a book on insurgency, The Sling and the Stone, and we worked together in Iraq. Good man. His statement is, okay, let's say everything starts going really well, that our casualty count goes down, and we see a 7% GDP increase in Iraq over the next 20 years, and an increasing level of reasonable, viable governance in Afghanistan. What do you get? This is his comment. You get Chad. And is that worth the national treasure that we're pouring into this country? When I get a chance, I run into friends and I call folks, both active duty and retired, and the statement is, okay, John, you've got a minute with the President of the United States. What are you going to tell him about Afghanistan? And yesterday at Reagan National Airport, I ran into a retired Special Forces colonel, and he says, I tell the President to pull pitch, which is a helicopter term to make the helicopter go straight up and out. And That's an SF colonel who has been over there some time. He was also over there as a businessman. And he kept running into wealthy Afghanis who would point at their wealthy homes, and you may have seen Rachel Maddow's piece. He did on the ground what Maddow did on the ground. He saw all these great palaces, but all the families are living in Dubai. So there's a brain drain and a money drain going outside of Afghanistan right now, and we all have to ask the question, what is the outcome? And I'm having a very difficult time working my way through the logic on all this when you consider the geopolitical issues associated with the positioning of the country and selling nuclear weapons in Pakistan and the problems with India, and you look at all that, and the president really has a dilemma.
So one of the obvious questions then is what happens if we leave? Anyone feel like taking on, what happens if the United States decides to leave?
I think it's probable that we'll see a period of increased conflict with a lot of these players and warlords, some of whom we've actually helped to prop up, fought for power and control. I think we might see neighboring countries who've invested quite a bit in their own relationships and proxies, such as Iran, such as India, such as Pakistan, work to protect those investments. But at the end of the day, I think it's very unlikely that we'd see a return to the 1990s with the Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. So yeah, I think Paul Pillar, a long-time intelligence analyst, the way he put it when he was discussing the president's policy was, even if everything goes perfect, if we achieve everything we set out to achieve in Afghanistan, the overall impact on U.S. national security could very well be nil. So that's an equation that kind of keeps running over and over in my mind.
Okay, so
One point down that I don't think there's anyone who's rational in this debate who's advocating us abandoning Afghanistan. I don't think there's anyone who's rational who's saying they want to wave the magic wand and be gone tomorrow. It's a question of what size force we have there, what size presence. Well, I call for a ceasefire, and political reconciliation. But so I think it's a bad argument that we get into about just leaving it, because it's not going to happen, and it doesn't make sense to do anyway. Just how do we conduct ourselves there in a way that makes sense for us strategically, as well as brings about an end to the Afghan conflict. The same way, so I don't think there's anyone who's rational who's arguing that we need to garrison Afghanistan for the next 60 years with 150,000 troops. I don't think there's anyone out there arguing that as well. So it's kind of a bad argument to get into about leaving, because I don't think anyone's actually advocating just leaving tomorrow, in an irresponsible manner.